To everyone who's signed up for this webinar, and welcome to all of you. I know that there are people across the world watching, and I'd like to thank both Lesley Mofokeng and Jonny Steinberg very much for agreeing to take part in this Wits Centre for Journalism webinar on journalism, literary journalism and history. Both of you have been in very high demand in the past month to talk about your books. So thank you for making a little bit of time for us. As you know, the Wits Centre for Journalism is a home for journalists who are both coming back for further study, and so they have a special interest in the kind you do. For those who don't know, I just want to introduce our panelists. So Jonny Steinberg has been a journalist, writer and academic, and he moves seamlessly between and across these worlds. Winnie and Nelson is his sixth book of nonfiction or literary journalism, as some people like to call it, and a bit of a departure from previous work in that this time he doesn't have a living person to interview in the way that he has done before, and he has to rely on more historical sources. He has collaborated with the University of Oxford, Yale, and of course with Wits. It's also associated with us at Wits. Lesley Mofokeng is a journalist, author, and a doctoral candidate and lecturer in the Wits Centre for Journalism. Who Moves Mountain was not his first book, as he's produced a few authorized biographies, but the first, I would think, is fair to say, Lesley, in which you chose to really pursue your passions. So I'd like to start by asking you to talk about what motivated you to choose these stories and these people. Lesley, if we can start with you. Your book is about your grandfather, and through reconstructing his story, you also tell the story of a community and a church, because he was a pastor in the Dutch Reformed Church, and a particular time in South Africa. Why did you choose to write about him?
Well, first of all, let me begin by saying thank you for inviting me, Prof, to this wonderful seminar, and a big hello to my fellow panelists, Jonny Steinberg, and everyone who's joined from across the world. I see a lot of people that are recognized, and I'm so happy that they took the moment to be with us this afternoon. So to answer your question, Prof, I would say that I've always had a curiosity of my grandfather. He was a larger-than-life figure in my life. I always observed how he was respected and how he was revered wherever he went. But I just could not understand where this came from. I had heard stories, I'd heard people talk about the great work that he did in the community of Gelexpan in the Lichtenburg area of today's Northwest. But there was nothing written, there was nothing tangible, there was nothing that I could refer to. Luckily, I had him around and I started asking him some questions, jotting down some points, lost them in the process. Some survived, some photos survived, but some of the anecdotes that he told me personally, I lost because I really didn't have a direction. I didn't know what I wanted to do with this information. All that changed when I came to Wits to pursue my master's degree, master's by research, and this was my topic, the life of my grandfather, as a dissertation, as a paper for my master's degree. And I think that environment gave me an opportunity to think through about what I wanted to do and how, most importantly, how I was going to present this life story. Was it just going to be a story of the great man, or was I going to be critical? Was I going to pursue other elements, and what inspiration was I going to draw from? So all I can say is that this has been a lifelong passion for me. Well, at least let me say from high school. I knew that I wanted to do something. I just didn't know what or how. And today here we are. We've got The Man Who Shook Mountains that was released in March 2023. And I also have a master's degree from Wits University, thanks to the book. Thank you, Prof.
Thank you. So, Jonny, let's turn to you. Unlike Lesley, subject, your subject, extremely well known, and so much had been written about both of them, and there was such seemingly publicly well-known characters. Why did you choose to revisit them, and how did you approach what seemed to be such a well-known story?
Thanks, Lesley, and hello to both Leslie's and
your book as well.
Thank you. Hi to both of you and to everybody who's joined. It's very good to be here. Lesley, I mean, I'd always written very intimately about living people and about anonymous people who I'd spent a lot of time with, and I guess I wanted to do something different and see if I could do the same, write as intimately as possible about dead people who I'd never known. So that was one, just methodologically, that was one challenge I wanted to set myself. Also, I'd always written about people who were everyday people, ordinary people, and tried to write about them in the way to show the scale of their lives and the world around them. And again, I wanted to, just as my growth as a researcher and a writer, do the opposite and look at people who really exercised power, who wanted power and got it, and what they did with it, and what it might mean to write intimately about somebody like that, rather than ordinary persons. So those were, methodologically, those were my two ambitions in setting about writing this book.
Did you feel like the need for a different, after the 5 books you had produced, did you feel like you needed to do something a little bit different or challenge your writer?
Yeah, I guess that's what I'm saying. Those were the two new things that I was trying to do. And they, in the history of what I'd done before, they were very new. They were very big challenges for me. I'd never done either of those two things before. Written about dead people rather than hang out with somebody for a year or two. It's methodologically massively different. And that's a huge challenge.
Just to take that further, the characters, I mean, in both of your books were well known. They were icons in a sense. Winnie and Nelson, we know publicly as national icons, and Lesley's grandfather was kind of a respected icon in his community. So maybe you can start, Lesley, and you go about writing about somebody and not producing the great man story that you referred to earlier.
Well, I think when the opportunity came to present the story of my grandfather, I was very much aware of the pitfalls and the challenges that I might face when writing a book of this nature. And these were sorted out and discussed in class in the long-form narrative journalism class year adverts. I was challenged by my classmates. I was challenged by my supervisors and the team here at Wits to sort of craft and sharpen a proper approach that will resonate with the reader, something that the reader will buy into and something that will be enjoyable to read. So a lot went into that. I had to put on a different cap. This was not just a grandson writing about a grandfather, but this was an author telling a story of a certain subject that happens to be close to him. And there was that intimacy because my grandfather actually brought me up. But I had to sort of distance myself and take a different lens and prepare myself to accept whatever might come up in discussions, whatever I might find in the archives, whatever is recorded about him. And afford him that space of being celebrated, as you say, Prof, as an icon. Because I suppose when one is seen as an icon, there is imperfection there. It is a revered title, but there are so many different views that people have when it comes to icons. And my grandfather had to be on that sort of pedestal for me and sort of exposing. And it comes out in the book with some of the people who are critical of the choices that he made and the direction that he took and put the rest of the family towards. And I'm glad that it happened that way, because as an icon, as I say, it can never be perfect.
And Jonny, you also faced a similar problem of two people who were so respected and admired, or so under of their political base. And when you start research and when you started your interviews, how did you overcome the challenge of people perhaps not wanting to be critical about Winnie or Nelson, people wanting to preserve them as these important public figures?
Well, in a sense, my job was much easier than Lesley's, because writing about your own family member is there's a huge weight of responsibility on your shoulders, and your own personal involvement, your own entanglement with it just makes it an enormously complex task. And in a sense, I was much freer. I was writing about people who had been strangers to me. Interviews were one part of what I did, and an important part. There were so many others, but I think a bigger problem I confronted in interviews was people saying, "The story has been done before. It's been flogged to death. Why do you want to do it again? And what more can I say?" And I was always surprised when somebody said that, because I thought that it had not been possible to write really properly about either of these two people as human beings while they were alive. That to write about them with all their foibles, their limitations, their imperfections, their nastiness while they're alive would have been an attack on them, and maybe even an attack on the South African project itself. And with their deaths, it actually became possible to really write about them as real people and keep sympathy with them. And everybody who I interviewed, I tried to explain that was my project. That's what I saw. And quite a few people came around to that and said, yes, we actually can talk about these people with some freedom, because what it means has changed.
You had to bring that to them. You had to kind of overcome their resistance in saying, well, there's nothing more to be told, and find your way into, I looked at your interviews. You had enormous number of people spoke to you. It's quite amazing. It's quite an achievement that so many get to speak to you about this.
I think part of that reaction I was talking about was their myths have become so encrusted. And part of what I was hoping to do was to not so much destroy those myths, but just to set alongside the myths the people who made them, the people who constructed them, and the terrible weight of those myths that they had to carry on their shoulders, what it meant to keep, Winnie and Nelson Mandela, their respective backs were nearly broken by the weight of keeping their myths aloft. And that connection between the real human being and the myth, and the work that it took to make the myth, to keep it going. The suffering and the pain and the drama of keeping those myths alive was such an interesting story.
And then in terms of the historical material that you used, apart from interviews, Lesley, did you use significant archives? I think, didn't you use church records and those sorts of things? How did you... What were the challenges of relying on those sorts of sources? Because often those sources are constructed in a certain kind of way. They're not constructed to tell the story you want to tell, but they're made by, the church elders, or in Jonny's case, the one important archive, which was the Seer archive, was made to spy and constrain. So how did you work with those archives?
Well, this is where it gets very interesting for me, Prof, in terms of the archive. So the Dutch Reformed Church has archives dating back to the 1770s. You can find them online. They are based in Cape Town. It's the entire sort of Cape Synod and the rest of South Africa. But they don't have Black archives. Black lives were not recorded. Deaths, births, marriages were not recorded. you can only find white records there. And what was particularly disastrous and tragic with my grandfather's story is that the church in Khelspan had some sort of turbulence. And when I went and inquired about the archives, I was told that they've been set alight in a fight of sorts with the minister that sort of replaced him. And so we had nothing to work with in terms of the written archive, in terms of church records. And all I had to go with was oral history, was oral records. Lucky for me, there were still people who worked with my grandfather, knew him very well, 6 years of his life, who were still alive and who were very generous, opened their doors, opened their hearts. Some of them were struggling to remember things. I mean, the youngest person I interviewed was in their 60s and the eldest well into their 80s. And that's where the challenge came in. I had to make sure that I double check facts, make sure that what this one person, says can be corroborated. So there was a lot more work, a lot more journalism that went into the sourcing of the facts and the points and the remembrance and the memories of the interviewees. So certainly for me, nothing was really written down. I think the only thing of precious value that I had is the baptismal certificate of my grandfather from Tabanchu, from I think 1930. And from there, I mean, it's just, photographs, thankfully, they survived. But in terms of the proper archive of the church, it was just tragic.
And Jonny, you refer to, at the end of your book, you have a special appendix where you refer to the archive of recorded conversations that you used. Could you talk a little bit more about that? You talk a little bit about the discomfort of actually archives.
Yeah. Well, let me start by saying that whether you're doing oral work and interviewing, so, hanging out with somebody over a protracted time, or whether your subjects are dead and you're looking at the artifacts that they've left in the world, I mean, either way, you kind of, what you don't want is simply somebody talking about their life and saying what it was, because there's so much hidden there. There's so much hidden in the narratives that people tell about themselves. What you really want, what's really golden, is to be able to watch somebody live their life and the choices that they make as they're living them. So when you're doing oral work, you hang out with somebody so much in order to have the privilege of actually seeing them in a crisis, seeing them in a crucial moment, seeing what they do when the stakes are really high. And I think then you really get inside them in a way that you don't simply by interviewing them. And similarly, if your subjects are dead, you want to come across material in which they have not spoken about themselves, but acted in the world. You want to see decisive actions that they've left. And in the case of Winnie and Nelson Mandela, there were two really crucial sources that were like that. And one were the letters that Nelson wrote to Winnie from prison. And they are really actions in the sense that they were apart. He was very in love with her. He feared losing her because they were apart. And his letters were a weapon to keep her. He needed to seduce her all over again. He needed to remind her of the fire between them. And the result is that those letters are extraordinarily self-revealing just because of how high the stakes were, what he was trying to do with them. So that was a wonderful source. And then to go into the source that you're alluding to, Kobie Coetzee, the Minister of Justice and Prisons, recorded all of Nelson Mandela's conversations with all of his visitors, including with Winnie. And that marriage was conducted in those conversations in over a 7 or 8 year period. That was the primary forum in which they spoke to one another. They're incredibly hard documents to interpret because, on the one hand, they couldn't be more intimate. This is a marriage, the most private of institutions conducting its affairs. On the other hand, they know that there's a microphone there, and they're very careful about what they say. So, no document is ever transparent. No document simply, announces what it's about. But these transcripts are particularly tricky because they're about so much, and yet they're just so, by their nature, very, very slippery.
So in a sense, whatever you use, you're always having to read across, because the material is not really prepared for your story. So you have to find a way to kind of archive to be able to pull out what you need. In the same way that with your interviews, you have to unset the interviewee, you have to, sweep away their notions. Well, we have to talk well of this person, or there's nothing more to be said.
Yeah,
So
requires... Oh, sorry, go on.
I was going to say that requires quite a lot of you as interviewers and as interrogators when you're doing the work.
Yeah, to give a concrete example, Nelson tells his daughter and her husband that he was caught, he was captured at Howick in 1962 because when he had a lover and she told her lover and he was an informer. And what do you do with that material? Is it true? Does he really think that? Does he believe that? Does he have decent information on that? What is the context of him talking to his daughter? Why is he telling her that? He also knows that his enemy is listening. And so, he's imparted a crucial piece of information about his life, but how to interpret it is not easy at all.
I think even in nonfiction, the role of the writer, there is a lot of interpretation. And that brings me to another question. You have both worked as journalists, and you were both worked quite a long time in the journalism world. In the move from journalism in newspapers and publications to these book-length projects, what did you draw on from your journalistic experience and skills, and where were the ways it limited you, and what were the ways in which you had to extend yourself? Perhaps, Lesley, I'll ask you to go first with this.
I think journalism helped me more than anything, because at the end of the day, I wanted to produce something that was factual, that was accurate, that was balanced, that was not just sort of propaganda of sorts. And I had to think back to my days as a journalist at the Sunday Times. I remember Jonny was across the road, across the office at business day. We used to see each other in the lifts in Rosebank. But anyway, so at the Sunday Times, we had what they call an accuracy test. And this accuracy test basically was an inquiry into your story, even questioning the motivation or the motive of your source. Is this person looking for revenge? Is this person reliable? Do you really believe what they tell you? So all of these things sort of expose you and your source. And I think when I wrote this book, I had to draw from that kind of experience to understand what is being presented to me, and to make sure that I just do not reproduce something that has a hidden agenda, or maybe does not actually fit with a larger project that I'm doing. So as I said earlier on, when I approached the topic of my grandfather, I did not just want the great man narrative. I wanted something that would be of value to the next reader, something that you can learn, because it's presented in a certain way and it shows no biases. I don't know if bias is the right word. Maybe let's say it's balanced and fair. And so I had to expose myself to everything that was thrown at me by different interviewees. There's an uncle, as I said, who criticized the choices that my grandfather made. I couldn't sweep it under the carpet and say it's going against the great man. I thought that it would challenge the reader, actually, who maybe have glorified the story from the beginning and gets confronted with this piece of information or piece of opinion that goes against what might have been, a wholly wholesome and perfect man, if ever there's a perfect man. So those choices had to be made. I think if I was not a journalist, I would have struggled to accept some of the things. But because of journalism, it made it easier for me to accept. and to digest it and to present it in a way that enriched the story.
And Jonny, do you credit journalism for any of your successes as a writer?
Yeah, I agree completely with everything that Lesley has said. I think that training to question who is talking to you, why they're saying what they're saying. I mean, ultimately, the question is who is actually writing the story? Is it you? Is it the people you're writing about? Such important, such difficult questions, and that is the heart of what good journalism is about. I think Lesley and I had slightly different experiences in as much as, although we worked on the same floor of the same building, Lesley was working for a weekly, and had time and space to invest enormous thought and energy and a kind of a level of slowness, which I think is absolutely necessary for good writing. I, across the road, or across the corridor, was working for a daily, which moves so quickly, which is its own excitement, but it can be frustrating. And I ultimately left because I felt that I kept hitting the surface of stories and was desperate to go underneath. And that rhythm of a daily paper, it gave some opportunity for that, but not enough. So journalism is one word that encapsulates quite different experiences, I think.
Yes, it does. Would you define what you're doing as literary journalism, or are you not attached to that term? I mean, by literary journalism, I mean the common definition of non-fiction written in the style of or using fictional devices. I've stopped being preoccupied with labels, with what to call it. It's by its nature hybrid. It's a composite. It's journalism. It's historiography. In some ways it's ethnography, and to mark out which territory belongs to whom. I'm not really exercised by that.
And Lesley, what would you say? Well, I mean, as a scholar of literary journalism, I would say that it is definitely literary journalism. I look at chapters like chapter 1 that talks about my visit to this church that I last was in 1984, and this is 2021, I think, or 2020, when I first go to this church, after 30, 40 years. And the descriptions, as well as, maybe let's first talk about what we would consider literary journalism. It's things like characterization, scene-by-scene construction, immersion, and dialogue, and all of those elements that would normally associate with novel writing and fiction writing. I find that I use that a lot in this book. The chapter of the church, how we visit this long abandoned hall, and you can have a conversation with the spiders in there, and they will not believe the stories that you tell them, that this used to be a venue for beauty contests and concerts and church services. I use that. I also, when you go to the chapter on Germiston, when I visit this now derelict, really famous gateway for Black laborers who come from the Free State and today's Free State and Limpopo and all of those regions. And the descriptions that I use there convey a certain vividness and also emotion, because I was walking in the footsteps of my grandfather, trying to recreate this world in 1930 when he first came to Germiston or Johannesburg to seek this new life with all of this education that he had from Tabanchu. And then the last chapter of the book also, that was written on top of Tababusiu, where I stand at the grave of King Mushweshwe. There's a lot of tools that I borrow from fiction writing that kind of brings the story to life. And I'd like to say that most of the chapters of this book truly rely on literary journalism.
I mean, I was so fascinated to listen to you talking about using both journalism and fiction, because it really resonates with me. I mean, tell me what you think of this, but for me, there's so many similarities between literary nonfiction and a novel, and the similarities are we borrow everything from fiction. We borrow plots, we borrow character, we borrow narrative arcs. But there's one thing that we can't do that a novelist can do, which is decide what's happening in somebody else's head, and that difference is just absolutely massive. It's in that way, to me, it seemed what we're doing is like writing a novel, but with our hands tied behind our back, and it just makes it it's one difference, but it's an absolutely massive difference for me. I don't know what you think of that.
I completely agree, Jonny. I think that's the best way to put it, because I think because of sort of the environment or the circumstances that you find yourself when you tell a nonfiction story, there's not much movement really. And the facts are staring you in the face some of the time. But I think the usage of nonfiction is just, or nonfiction tools is, I don't know if I should say beautify the language or bring it to life, or I think it's a means to an end. But I agree with you that you write with your hands tied at the back. And that's what I found with my project, and actually other projects that I've done, which were biographies, where I find that I really cannot run wild. It is my dream one day to run wild, throw caution to the wind, and just create something that's not there. I think that's a wonderful muscle to exercise. I've been challenged by people who are fiction writers who say that maybe it's time that you step out of that comfort zone of nonfiction and challenge yourself and just run wild with your imagination. I don't think I'm ready, but it's something that I'm thinking.
I don't think I'll ever be ready. I think writing nonfiction has scared me off having the confidence ever to make up what's happening in somebody's head. It's such a discipline to say I actually don't know.
Yes.
But I wanted to ask you, just the link between the project and your grandfather and your current project. I mean, you've left from writing about a revered figure to one of the most revered figures, in the history of African nationalism in South Africa. And what's the connection between the two projects? What took you on that path?
Well, maybe I should introduce the next project, because I don't think a lot of people in the audience know that I am here at Wits and I'm studying Plaki's journalism and reading these newspapers from 1901 to 1915, Kurante Botswana, Tsala Botswana, and Tsala Yabatho. This is just really the next step in my scholarly work. I have always been a lover of history. History was my favorite subject at school. And I found myself in this intersection of journalism and history. And I think it's a sweet spot for me because I get to do two things that I absolutely love. And I find that reading these newspapers dating all the way back to just after the Boer War, I think the Boer War ended at 1902, but the Mofokeng siege, the particular one that involves Plaki, was from 1899 to 1900. So a year later, he was the editor of Kurante Botswana, but officially starting in 1902. And I find that this is such a useful resource if you want to talk about the Black experience post the Boer War. I feel like a lot has not been said about the Black experience post the Boer War. A lot of African history or a lot of Black history is told from, let's say, the drum era into apartheid, all the way, up to, maybe the 80s. But there's something that we've missed that is so significant in understanding Black lives and Black positionality from 1901 to 1915. That was a critical period. This is the lead up to 1910, the Union. This is the lead up to 1912, the South African National Congress, and obviously 1913, the Land Act. And all of these really important milestones in the history of our country have been told, but I don't think enough from the Black perspective. For example, I was reading The Man Who Founded the ANC by Mongangane Wilfred, the story of Pixley Sakaseme, which I thought was fascinating, had a lot of detail, a lot of information that I actually was oblivious to. And then reading that with Tsala ya Botswana in 1912 or 1911, so like building up to the creation of the South African Native National Congress, has just been a fascinating journey, putting the two side by side to each other and understanding how we got to the South African Native National Congress has just been an experience. So it's just another world that I'm getting exposed to.
What we were talking about was this issue of whether nonfiction writing of this type can cross the divides, and perhaps I think the context of the comment when you made it, Jonny, was a discussion at a panel where we were talking about South Africa still having so many different kinds of communities, that sometimes different kinds of publics that are not in conversation with each other, and whether this kind of work can allow people to understand each other over those divides. Do you still see that as an important project?
Well, I mean, I think we have to be realistic and look at the reading public in South Africa and how small and socially narrow it is. So, I mean, my greatest discomfort in writing about ordinary people and presenting their lives in a book is that it's almost like to present 90% of South Africa to the other 10%. So I think that we should always keep in mind just how who is reading in South Africa. I mean, there's an enormous project of expanding the reading public, and it's massively important, and it should determine what we're writing and how we're publishing it. As things stand now, it's an increasingly it's racially considerably more diverse than it used to be, but it is really a privileged minority who's reading a lot of books.
Well, I also know with Lesley that one of your objectives, or one of the things you thought was important in your book, was to tell the history of Black communities that hasn't been told. And you thought that was an important project. Taking up from what Jonny says about the small reading public, how would you see your project then? How would you then see your book as contributing to that project? And do you think that there is a problem because of the reading public being so small, of being able to extend, this history to others?
Yes. Well, Prof, while we were disconnected, Jonny and I spoke about my next project on the Solplaki, and I was telling him about the newspapers and telling the African experience, or the Black experience post-Boer War up to 1915, and all of those milestones in the history of South Africa. So I think this book also contributes to this conversation. And I must say that earlier on, when you asked about why I did this project, I actually remembered that I didn't have role models when I started, or when I started thinking about telling this book or this story of my grandfather. It's not done. I mean, we come from a background where letters are banned. My grandmother would say, okay, this is litter. I've got 200 letters between my friends and I. This is waste. And we set them alight. And so stories lived in our minds, stories lived in our mouths through oral traditions. And we lost a lot of stuff because of that. We lost a lot of knowledge because of that. So when I started writing my grandfather's story, I didn't have an example really back then as a young writer in maybe 2000. I didn't have an example to say someone told the story of their grandfather in this way, I could do it this way. So I feel that this is a contribution towards encouraging more writers and growing this audience of readers. I, for example, read the story of Onkgopotse Tiro as an example of someone telling their family story and doing it so well that he does not read, like forced or biased or anything, but really as a good piece of literature that you can enjoy as an outsider. But the work is still, there's a lot of work to be done. There are a lot of booksellers and people and publishers who are involved in the book space who are pushing to grow this audience and make sure that the stories told are of high quality, but also are repeated more often.
What I noticed about both of you in these books is that though you're writing about individuals, you also are, through the individuals, you're also telling a story of a time and a place. And in your case, Jonny, a set of political decisions that had to be made and political projects. And in the case of Lesley, community projects, church projects. How do you go about getting the texture of the time? What would you say to somebody who wants to write this kind of a project, to how to bring those people and times to life? What do you collect for that? Let's ask you to start, Jonny.
I think that if your central characters are alive and animated and rich, they will bring the times with them. I think that if you're struggling to bring your central characters to life, it's even more difficult to bring the times to life. And in my case, we're not talking about a time, but a long stretch of time, from Nelson Mandela's birth in 1918, right through to the post-apartheid period. So lots of context to keep conjuring. And really it's the force of the characters and how they're changing through the times. Who they become as young adults, as middle-aged people, as prisoners, as people who are banished, then as leaders. I think that if you can use that character energy to sweep up the context, that's really the only way I know how to do it.
Jonny, I agree with you. I like what you say, character energy. And I think that also comes through in my book when you look at how the stories are told. With me, I obviously had to rely on a lot of interviews and a lot of people who knew my grandfather, who worked with him. Some of them actually credited him for the successes that they later enjoyed in life, and the material possessions that they had, and how he sort of became a father to them, or maybe even a father figure. And by the way, there's a story of my grandfather also. That's my grandmother. That's also another character that's in the book that adds a certain texture to the whole narrative, to the whole story, and the energy that she also brings into telling this particular time. I mean, the story really starts from 1930s and ends in 1984. But I do go back into time with family history and track the family, family tree that dates back to the 1700s, the 1600s. And all of that, I think, enriches the narrative. We're trying to get into the Q&A, Jonny. We're trying to open some questions here.
From Letitia Cassels. I find your new project fascinating, Lesley. In my own research about morality and censorship in print, I also found very few references to the majority of the population in South Africa before the 1920s. I found also that the histories and narratives that have been preserved have been very specific, either people as oppressed or as an exclusive kind of Black intellectual, which includes Sol Plaatje, I think.
Okay. Thank you, Letitia, to that comment. It's not really a question, but yes, I think this is why we need this kind of work, this kind of projects to come to the fore, this kind of research, because it contributes to the writing into history, as the expression goes, so much that we don't know of, we're not sure of, or we have glimmers of, we get snippets from this and that in history. But we really need to invest time in going back, and I find that newspapers are very, very useful. There's another question, Prof. Here. Let's just hear.
Before you say that, I also want to say that I think, Jonny, you were a little bit modest, because in actual fact you used an enormous number of newspapers over the various time periods to create a sense of the fashion, the life, community life, and all kinds of things to bring those eras for life in Winnie and Nelson.
Sorry, just a quick word. Reading newspapers from the 40s, 50s, and 60s was a revelation. I mean, you really realize how much history leaves out, how history reconstructs a time and leaves out almost everything about it.
We have a question here from John Back. Thanks, Lesley and Jonny, for your comments, especially about literary journalism and your views of where you situate your writing within that genre. So my question to you both is this. In your journalism writing for dailies, you were forced into reporting about your subject, whatever or whoever that was. Whereas in your literary journalism ethnography, you were both allowed to use your subject to write about yourself. Inescapable, I guess, in writing and researching literary nonfiction. So when, if ever, did you feel that you were stealing from your subjects to satisfy your narrative? That's a bit of a tough one. Jonny, do you want to start with that answer?
I'm not sure I quite understand the question, and I hope that I'm answering it. But I think that when I'm doing oral work and writing about somebody's life by spending a great deal of time with them, I have to make myself quite a central character, because the way in which I discover the person is through their relation to me. That is the most revealing thing about them to me, from my perspective. So much of their world and their life I just don't know. What I do know is how they connect with me, and that ends up being my greatest insight into them. And I need, for my own authority, I need the reader to know how I know what I know. And that's by putting myself in. Whether it's stealing the story for myself, I mean, that's a really good question and an intractable question. And yes, I mean, ultimately, you are the author, you have shaped the text. You have made all the decisions which makes your character appear the way they have. And in a powerful sense, that is a form of theft. You have represented their life, and any form of representation does some violence. So yes. I quite like the way you phrased the question. I think it's very powerful.
Definitely. Okay.
It is a tough one. It is a tough one, but I have a confession to make, that whenever I touch the subject of memorializing or immortalizing my grandfather's story while he was still alive, he was never interested. He was never keen. If he had his own way, the book should not have been published, I think. So I have to confess to the stealing part, that I dragged him into something that he was not really interested in. And I just think he came from that period of sort of service to community and not expecting anything in return. And in telling his story, while I feel that there was so much to learn as a student of history who understands the importance of telling these stories and writing into history. That's why I get into conflict with my subject. I wonder if my grandfather was alive, or if we were to come back from the dead, what his opinion would be about the book, about his life being put out there, and about the opinions expressed about him by all of these people that I interviewed. It's an interesting question. Thank you, John, for that.
I'd also like to add something. You're as a writer of this kind of work, you are always shaping the narrative, even if it's just by asking the questions, deciding on the topics, who it is you're going to interview. And for both of you, you do put yourselves in the story. And I think that in some ways, perhaps it's more honest to put yourself in to some extent and say, this is what I observed, this is what I thought, instead of being omniscient and telling the story in a seamless way. And I think both of you came up against contradictions and conflicts of memory or conflicts of information in your stories. And one of the ways to resolve that is to step in a way as saying, well, here I am as the writer, so-and-so saying this, so-and-so saying this, but I think this, or I asked myself that.
Can I just say, Prof, that in my case, because this is someone that I knew, my grandfather was someone that I knew, I would be confronted with an opinion about him. And in my recollections of my conversations with him and my knowledge of the person that I'm writing about, if I felt strongly about that opinion, then I step in and I say, but in my recollection, this is not the case. Especially if I felt like something would be libelous or something is probably not accurate, I don't completely disregard it and take it out of the narrative, out of the book, but I insert myself and put some sort of an opinion or a disclaimer, if you like, to the story.
We're going to do one last question. This is from Vinayak Bajwaj. A question I had, this is for Jonny. A question I had was about language and about something we lose by not having the same cultural touch points and references. Did Winnie and Nelson ever discuss their lives in isiXhosa? And what role does language have to play, both in how they wanted to express their collective political identity and how you, as interpreter of their lives, have been able to decipher their conversation? Or has the issue of language never been a complex dimension of your attempts to investigate this story? I'm 100 pages into your book and realizing that what I thought was a well-understood story is completely not what I thought it was.
That's a great question. So, all the 27 years that Nelson Mandela was in prison, he was not permitted to write letters in any language but English or Afrikaans. And so he was bound to conducting his marital relationship with his wife in English. His letters would not have been sent if they were in any other way. When she came to visit him again, he was not permitted to talk in isiXhosa. It had to be in English, and occasionally they violated that and shifted. And so, yes, for all of those years, they were conducting their marriage not in their first tongues. I mean, how much difference did that make to the communication? I don't know. I would hesitate to venture not much, since at that point, English was the dominant language in both their lives, certainly in the public sphere and to an extent in the private sphere. It's a counterfactual. How would things have gone between them if they'd been talking in isiXhosa? I don't know.
And I mean, there is always this question of language whenever we are working in this area of literary journalism or narrative nonfiction, interviewing people who may speak their first language, maybe not English, and the thing is written in English. We just want to take one last question from Janet Remington. Fascinating discussion. Do you both think there are ways of taking the insights, perspectives and narratives from the literary journalistic nonfiction you're working on to a broader public via other media, TV documentaries, radio programs, YouTube, etc.? I know you've both done podcasts and more. Well, there's a challenge.
Yeah, well, Prof, thank you for that question. I do think there is a space for that. I think our stories can live beyond books. In fact, they should be living beyond books, so they can reach a broader audience. We spoke earlier on about the smaller audience, the reading public in South Africa. So there are other elements and platforms that we really should be exploring. And I like Janet's question, and my answer would be yes, they should be. Yes, there's a possibility, and yes, there should be those opportunities.
Jonny?
Yeah, the short answer is yes, absolutely. I mean, the slightly longer answer is that every medium has its own language, and every language has to be mastered to be used properly. The one language I know really well is book length nonfiction. I'm a little intimidated about other mediums, but very, very eager to try them. But one last thing is that, I think that when you transfer a book into another medium, something very important is lost, and vice versa. If you put another medium into a book, each medium has its own power, which is unique to itself. So I don't think a book can be simply transferred into something else. I think it really does, in a profound way, become something else.
Okay, we have to wrap up now. I'd like to just end by thanking you, Jonny and Lesley, for the wonderful conversation and for bearing with us through the network problem. I encourage everybody to go out and buy these books and read them. They are really both wonderful experience. Thank you to everybody who joined.